أصحاب السعادة، الزميلات والزملاء والحضور الكرام، نلتقي اليوم لإطلاق التقرير السنوي للوساطة
event of launching the book on world mediation effort at a moment when armed conflict is on the increase and a lack of investment in peacemaking and mediation efforts. This reflects structural changes in the international order manifested in lack of multilateralism. And in this context, we cannot view mediation as a neutral practice. It's a political practice within the bounds of institutional peripherals, and it's determined by the availability of political will and the necessary resources. Hence, the idea of this report or this book, which is one of the products our center is proud to launch. The report is not just a descriptive one, nor is it a promotion of any particular efforts. It's a critical view and a critique of the practices which are reforming the mediation efforts, and at a time when the logic of might and power seems to replace mediation. And in this book, there is an attempt to combine the expertise of analysts and researchers in an attempt to present this work to decision makers in a continuation of the mandate and the mission of this center to bridge the gap that this part of the world, this region, suffers from, and that is the lack of knowledge production in this field of mediation. In this context, the report is directly linked to the Qatar Mediation Forum, which is organized annually to provide a platform between decision makers, researchers, and analysts, and to provide a space for linking outcomes with efforts made on the ground in line with the center's approach of linking between policy and practices. The report this year focuses on 4 pivots: the international context, and also mediation and a highly costly environment, and in view of an international order which is being more and more dismantled, and we take into account Sudan, Congo, and other examples. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleagues who took part in preparing this report with a group of our researchers and Stimson Center, and all the colleagues who took part. And I conclude by congratulating all our colleagues who contributed to this work, and specifically Dr. Seán Deely, my colleague from our center, who played a pivotal role in editing this report and to maintain its cohesion and coherence. And this is a collective effort reflecting the mission of our center to build on the partnerships we have established, which is represented here with the Geneva Institute, CIPRI, and other international organizations. I don't want to take too much of your time. I invite my colleague Dr. Sean. تفضل بالحديث عن الرد. شكرا جزيلا والسلام عليكم.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning for the launch of this first edition of the World Mediation Report. The report is the result of a collaboration between the Centre for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and a group of distinguished scholars and international relations experts from some of the leading universities and policy centres around the world. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Alex de Waal, Dan Smith, and Sara Hellmüller, who've travelled here today for the launch of the report and have contributed their time in the editorial support of the report and also in 3 outstanding chapters that you will read. Their chapters and the other chapters in the report contribute to a wealth of analysis and insights into the state of peace mediation and the challenges mediators face amid the breakdown of the post-Cold War peacebuilding model and an increasingly fragmented global environment. In chapter after chapter, analyzing the context, the mediators, case studies in Gaza, Syria, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Horn of Africa, 4 overarching themes emerge in the report. First, a growing consensus among global experts that norms prohibiting the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state and the targeting of civilians are collapsing, and that the global order is at a critical inflection point regarding multilateral cooperation to prevent conflict. Second, an increasing sense of conceptual crisis in peace mediation. The traditional model of peace building, which focused on negotiated, comprehensive settlements supported by international consensus, is obsolete. This leads to a shift away from conflict resolution and transformation towards short-term conflict management, ceasefires, humanitarian access, and increasingly transactional mediation that often risks undermining long-term peace building. Third, while traditional approaches stagnate, ad hoc coalitions involving or led by non-Western states with influence, access, and deep-rooted traditions in mediation, often primarily concerned with regional stability, are now the main drivers of peacemaking. States like Qatar and Oman exemplify this shift with flexible, principled, yet pragmatic interventions, often in coalition with traditional mediators. More complex, interest-driven configurations are also evident. Fourth, and finally, the role played by ad hoc coalitions, while essential, is not enough. Durable peace requires transformation based on a comprehensive approach that moves beyond temporary ceasefires to address root causes, involving all stakeholders in a process to build trust, equity, and long-term commitment. This is what the traditional peace-building approach sought to do. The challenge to peacemakers and mediators, and to all of us now, is how to recreate such a system. Let me tell you a little bit about the chapters in the report. Part 1 of the report presents 3 chapters, analysing the operating context for peace mediation, one in which peacemakers are attempting to address record levels of conflict and militarization, while the world seems increasingly to be preparing for war. In Chapter 2, Comfort Hero, president of the International Crisis Group, addresses the shift in US foreign policy in response to the return of great power competition, noting with deep concern the US withdrawal from global leadership and multilateral conflict management under the second Trump administration. In Chapter 3, Dan Smith, who's here with us today, and we'll talk more about his chapter. Dan is former director of SIPRI, spent 10 years at the helm of SIPRI, and contributed a chapter to the report. He paints a picture of a world preparing for war, with violent conflict reaching levels not seen since the end of the Second World War, and global military spending at an all-time high of $2.7 trillion. That's the context. Part 2 is about mediation in practice, and we have case studies from the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and the Great Lakes regions. In Chapter 4, Professor Sara Hellmüller and Bilal Saleme from the Center on Conflict, Development and Peacebuilding examine how great power competition has exacerbated deep-rooted conflicts in Syria and Gaza, undermining mediators and encouraging conflict parties to prioritize military victories over political negotiations. In Chapter 5, Professor Alex de Vaux, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, calls for a reassessment of the real politics of conflict and its resolution in the Horn of Africa, where instead of state building or democratic change, peacemaking is concerned with short-term political survival. Alex foresees a future in which commercial deal-making may become a primary driver of political pacts. In the Great Lakes case study in Chapter 6, Richard Moncrief and Ksenia Oksamitna analyzed the 30-year regionalized conflict in the DRC. Echoing findings from other chapters in the report, the authors conclude that a major obstacle to the peace process is the belligerents' belief that they can better advance their interests through military force than through negotiations. Part 3 presents chapters about the mediators, and it explores the roles played by Qatar, by China, and by women mediators. In Chapter 7, Yun Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center, presents a comprehensive overview of the thought and practice of Chinese peace mediation. The chapter covers China's motivations for engaging in conflict mediation in the context of its expansive global investments and its rapid rise to great power status, and explores how issues related to its geography, border stability, and economic interests have seen Beijing increasingly insert itself into regional disputes across the Middle East, Africa, and Eurasia. In Chapter 8, our own Sam Milton, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, charts how Qatar has emerged as a leading actor in peace mediation, reflecting the growing influence of regional mediators and the needs arising from the shift to a more multipolar world. The chapter also analyzes Qatar's role in the multi-party mediation between Hamas and Israel and in de-escalating the Iran-Israel 12-day war. In Chapter 9, Iranian author Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, reflects on the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 last year. Sanam assesses progress towards commitments made over the years to provide support for women mediators and to enable their inclusion in formal mediation roles. She urges a renewed commitment to meaningful support for women's participation in peacemaking. In the concluding section, Part 4, we look at mediation trends and prospects for the future. In Chapter 10, Assessing the State of Peace Diplomacy Towards Strategic Adaptation, Akim Venman of the Geneva Graduate Institute highlights growing problems including sectoral overcrowding, competition for funding, and the sidelining and undermining of institutions supporting the peaceful resolution of conflict, and proposes a global peace diplomacy movement that builds momentum towards a stronger shared foundation of the vision, principles, approaches, and means for peace diplomacy. In the final chapter, Chapter 11, Mediation Trends and Ways Forward, Isaac Svensson, the the Dag Hammarskjöld Professor in Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, provides a rich analysis of the global trends that affect mediation. Highlighting the decline in mediation processes in recent years, he notes that the changing nature of conflict reduces the likelihood of a hurting stalemate and therefore ripeness for mediation. The chapter also highlights the risks associated with transactional mediation, where economic benefits are a central focus of an approach that seeks to pacify conflicts and not transform them. Concluding on a more positive note, Isaac notes that many of the challenges facing contemporary peacemakers are not entirely new. And he recommends a return to the principles of the Hammarskjöld mediation approach, a willingness to engage in dialogue with all parties, a readiness to act in situations where there are opportunities to make progress, and a commitment to anchoring mediation practice in international law. We hope the report will provoke a wide-ranging debate on the state of peace mediation and what needs to happen for it to remain effective. Thank you very much. Enjoy the discussion.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon and chair this panel addressing a major issue in a very critical moment as the region and the world are holding their breath of what will happen in Geneva today, what will happen between Ukraine and Russia, and remembering that post-Second World War, more than 300 war and conflict around the globe, and in 2024, more than 61 active war and conflict in 36 countries. Remembering these kind of facts make the mediation discussion not only important, but needed every day, every minute, every second. And it puts more pressure on mediators, on countries to pay enough attention to this, considering the three facts: the disrespect to the international law that the world is suffering from, the collapse of international order, and most importantly, the disrespect of the human rights, which is becoming a pattern in global politics. Today, to discuss this important report, Peace Mediation in the Era of Normative and Institutional Collapse, we are honored to have three of the authors of this report. We have the first speaker, Alex de Waal, which he's the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, the Middle East, Syria, and Israel-Palestine. We have also Sara Hellmüller, Research Professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute, Trends in Armed Conflicts, Militarization, and Global Insecurity. And finally, we will have Dan, a former director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Every speaker will have around 12 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A. According to the schedule, we should finish by 1:30. I will start with you, Alex, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today and an honor to be part of this very important program. So in my contribution to this, I looked at the challenges of the Horn of Africa in general and of Sudan in particular over the last couple of decades, where we have seen multiple efforts at resolving conflicts and sadly a decreasing pace of success. And I want to just dwell a little bit upon some of the lessons that have been learned and some of the drivers of the decreased rate of success, and then mention the current moment in Sudan, which goes beyond actually what is in my contribution. So the Horn of Africa has been a sort of a place in which the African peace and security architecture was at its most developed. We saw a succession of initiatives in which the African Union, the United Nations, and international partners tried to seek long-term stable solutions for some of the most complex conflicts. And we had a fair degree of success. If we look back about 20 years ago, in the context of the comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in Sudan 21 years ago, in the context of efforts towards the stabilization of Somalia, and the role of Ethiopia, which at that time was internally at peace and was also the anchor of peace and security in the region. We could be optimistic. We could be optimistic that the basic formulae had been found for a whole spectrum of peace activities, starting with diplomacy, defining the problems, which is the first task of the mediator, identifying the key norms, principles, institutions that were required in order to address those problems, and an infrastructure of support in terms of peacekeeping operations, and in terms of the international financial, diplomatic, and other support that was necessary. This began to unravel. And I think we can identify a global reason and a regional reason why this began to unravel. The global reason was that in order for any peace agreement to be sustainable, there has to be a peace dividend for the people as a whole. There has to be sufficient funds available for ordinary people to feel the genuine benefits of peace. And there has to be enough of a flow of finance into the coffers of the state in order for the state to be able to pay its civil servants, to deliver on essential services, and to have an effective set of security mechanisms. And in the last 15 years, what we have seen across the region of the Horn is that these capacities have shrunk. And so if we were to take the case of the Sudanese revolution in 2019, what really condemned that was the fact that the civilian government that was civilian-headed government that was put in supposedly in a position of authority in 2019 simply did not have the money to deliver. And there was no debt relief. There was no money in the public coffers. The money that was there was really in the hands of the military, who had no interest in a successful democratic revolution. And at the same time, more money was being put into the hands of the political budgets of the political operators. And this brings me to the regional dimension, which is that the region, Northeast Africa, was becoming integrated into the Middle East as a sort of security hinterland for the Arabian Gulf. And what this meant was that when there were actors in the Gulf that were interested not so much in promoting peace, but in promoting their own particular security, commercial, political interests, with very deep pockets, far more resources than were available to the actors in the region. And that money went directly into the political money and the security budgets of those actors. The balance tipped in favor of conflict and in favor of when peace agreements were made. They were made primarily with the benefits of those belligerents in mind. So that those peace agreements shifted from being comprehensive agreements that had a long-term time horizon, a guarantee on a future constitutional framework and a future economic framework that could deliver for the people, they shifted into being short-term bargains and security pacts among those belligerents, which were only good for as long as those particular political conditions persisted. And some of the countries in members of the GCC, I'm afraid, were culpable in funding that political marketplace in the Horn in a way that actually inflamed the tensions. The last point I want to make is about the current situation, which is that when the war broke out in Sudan almost 3 years ago, it's now been going for more than 1,000 days with absolutely catastrophic consequences. It was evident that the first steps towards peace required that the regional powers that were backing the belligerents needed to be involved in the process. They either needed to come to an agreement or they needed to agree to step back. And I'm talking here candidly about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This was clear. Unfortunately, the only political power that could have brought those powers to the table was the United States. And under the Biden administration, it was not ready to do that. And in saying this was an African problem, I'm afraid the Biden administration condemned it to non-solution. The Trump administration, with Secretary Rubio, took up the baton and actually did the right thing. It convened the Quad being the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, with a formula. And if one listens to the speech, the presentation that was made by Special Envoy Mahjoob Boulos at the UN Security Council last week, it was extremely strong in identifying the steps that needed to be taken and the outcome that was desired by the Quad, which was a civilian-led government without a role for the military. And the steps being a humanitarian truce, permanent ceasefire, political talks, and rehabilitation. What Special Envoy Boulos did not mention was international law, international norms. And there is a scenario, there is a fork in the road at the moment. There is a scenario in which what Secretary Rubio, Special Envoy Boulos do is they take this formula to President Trump's Board of Peace, and there is a ceremony at which the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others come together and shake hands, and then hand the process to the UN Security Council, supported by other multilateral actors, informed by international law and norms, and it moves forward. I would very much support that. There is another scenario in which Sudan's peace process becomes a hostage of an ongoing transactional, commercially oriented process without respect for those norms and processes and institutions, in which case I fear that Sudan would be condemned to continuing indefinite instability and turbulence. So we stand at something of a crossroads there, and I hope that this report contributes to the very crucial debate on that very particular issue right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Sara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. And congratulations, of course, to the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for the launch of this important report. So in our chapter that I co-authored with my colleague Bilal Salaime, we analyze mediation in the context of the Middle East, and more specifically Syria and Israel-Palestine, but we also try to distill some lessons for mediation more broadly. And we argue that after a relatively favorable global context for mediation in the 1990s, we see two re-emerging trends that are exemplified in our two case studies that impact the very basics of mediation. And the first one is this reprioritization of military over political means to address conflicts, especially in conflicts that involve proclaimed terrorists, In other words, what we call the erosion of the norm of political settlements. And the second trend we identify is a prioritization of bilateral or minilateral arrangements to address conflicts, bypassing multilateral frameworks and, of course, especially the UN. We argue in our chapter that these two trends can be traced back to the response to 9/11 and the war on terror, but they have been reinforced in recent years. And this is clearly shown in the two conflicts that we analyze in our chapter, so Syria and Israel-Palestine, but we can also see them in other contexts from Yemen to Ukraine and Sudan. So let me briefly speak about each of these two trends. First, the erosion of the norm of political settlements. Here we note the trend that conflict parties increasingly turn to diplomacy or political negotiations as a last rather than first resort to address their conflicts. So in Syria, both conflict parties, but especially the Assad regime before it fell, pursued military victories supported, of course, by external allies, both regional and global ones. And this, we argue, is the same in Israel-Palestine, where the space for political negotiations has progressively eroded for at least the past decade, normalizing military occupation and the most atrocious forms of violence, including genocide. And more globally, this trend is confirmed by the declining number of armed conflicts actually being mediated, as shown also in an article that Isaac Svensson published. And it is reflected in the declining number of comprehensive peace agreements that Alex also mentioned. And this, of course, does not mean that force was previously absent as a tool of addressing conflicts, far from it, but it re-emerged more visibly even as a seemingly first impulse of some political actors, as we also see currently in the US-Iran negotiations. The second trend that we illustrate in our chapter is this trend of deals being brokered in bilateral or minilateral forums, oftentimes sidelining multilateral frameworks such as the UN or also regional organizations. And again, in our two case studies, this was clearly the case. The UN special envoys, the 4 subsequent envoys who were mandated to mediate in Syria before the fall of Assad, were frequently marginalized. This is also because, of course, they lacked relevant UN Security Council backing, because 18 resolutions were vetoed between 2011 and 2023 in the Security Council, most of them by Russia. And then peacemaking, of course, shifted to the Astana process hosted by Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which did negotiate de-escalation deals, but despite pretending otherwise, fundamentally challenged the UN-led process in Geneva. And in Israel-Palestine, of course, the UN has also been relegated to the background, with the UN Security Council largely blocked, the US also casting several vetoes. We have the Gaza peace plan, of course, brokered by the US, with the UN again playing a mostly symbolic role, if one at all, although, of course, it was endorsed in a UN Security Council resolution. And beyond Syria and Gaza, for instance, in Ukraine, no UN special envoy was even appointed, or if appointed, they are quite rapidly sidelined, like in Sudan. So we end the chapter with what we see as the consequences of these two trends, namely that conflicts are not really resolved anymore, but violence is at best suppressed and contained. And this may be important, of course, in and of itself, and we, of course, do not want to downplay the importance and relevance of reducing violence. But it also means that there is a high risk of violence resurfacing periodically, and this risk is very high. We therefore make a strong argument for complementing this current transactional deal-making, which may have positive outcomes in the short term, with longer-term political solutions, what Seán also mentioned, as we argue that otherwise disputes over political status, territory, and other core issues may resurface and violence resume, often with unbearable human costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sara. Appreciate it. Dan, flowers of you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mahjoob, and thank you also to the Centre for involving me in this extraordinarily important enterprise. My chapter, written with a colleague, Ian Davis, who's the executive editor of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's yearbook, looks at the big picture. So we look at the record high number of armed conflicts at the moment. It's 61 if you use the threshold criteria that our colleagues in Uppsala use. If you take all forms of violent conflict that were being recorded around the world last year by organized groups or semi-organized groups, there were 177 during 2024. And giving you a quick peek into the figures for 25, which are not yet finalized, the number is slightly down, but the death toll is rather sadly up. Listening to Alex and Sara and reading through the report, you could be forgiven, perhaps, for thinking that there is really very little peace activity going on in the world. In fact, that's not the case. Now, the level of it has declined. There's a database, the PAX database, held by colleagues in Edinburgh University, which tracks all peace agreements, not just the final agreements, but the agreements to agree, the agreements to sit down and talk, the framework agreements, the agreements to continue. And during the 2010s, so in the last decade, there were almost 100 of these agreements per year on average. In the 2020s, when we're feeling that the conflict landscape is very serious, the security landscape very bleak, there's 35 a year on average. So the activity has fallen off quite sharply, but it is far from zero. So I think that we cannot seek an explanation for what is going wrong in that level of activity. And I also think that we cannot seek an explanation for what is going wrong in the failures of mediation itself and of mediators. Though errors do get made, have been made, actually mediators in this era can call on a considerable body of experience going back certainly 3.5 decades to the end of the Cold War, but also longer, with a number of different kinds of tools in a very rich toolbox of potential activity, from community involvement through gender equality, through financial instruments, through security-first approaches, and so on. So there's no lack of means. What we argue is that the context is extraordinarily unpropitious and destructive. So we look to geopolitics for the explanation of what is going wrong. As has been mentioned, as Seán mentioned, military spending now worldwide is at its highest ever level, $2.7 trillion US. In stable dollars, in other words, counting out the effects of inflation, this is almost double what the level of military spending was in 1989 and 1990. And the signs are that it will increase again. CIPRI's database recording military expenditure shows a run of 10 years of increases in the global level. And that is the longest run in the database going back to 1945. There is very little doubt that that run will continue next year. On the nuclear front, we're seeing the end of strategic arms control between the USA and Russia. That's effectively 50 years of arms control has just come to an end. We're now back to a situation that was the case before 1972, when the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was agreed, where there is no agreed bilateral framework between Russia and the USA for control of nuclear weapons. And that raises fears about increased weapons proliferation. Although the norm of non-proliferation is still strong, and although the treaty still stands, there is increasingly public discussion about the possibilities of new nuclear weapons owners emerging onto the international scene in this region, in Northeast Asia, and also with variations in how it happens in Europe. It is also perfectly clear that international cooperation is down. It's not out, but it's reduced. And in one of the examples of that is that one can look at the efforts that are being made to hold back the level, multi-fronted ecological crisis that the world now faces in climate change, in the loss of biodiversity and biomass, and in pollution, and see how little progress is being made, even where there seems to be massive diplomatic effort committed. So if one thought that it was the task of what we call world order and the international institutions to hold back the ecological crisis, get us along the road towards nuclear disarmament, and achieve peace and conflict resolution, then you would see that international order is not succeeding on all fronts. In other words, the problems that Sara and Alex and other co-authors in the yearbook are reporting upon are all of them, in one sense, symptomatic of this problem of the erosion of world order. And so one of the big tasks that obviously comes out of that is to think, how is it possible to start reconstructing the institutions and the norms? And I believe, like most people, I think, who have looked at this, that while it's tempting to think about, reform of the whole architecture and producing blueprints, it's more important to think about the practical steps that can be taken to build cooperation, to respect the norms, to revive the laws, and to move forward. Now, I want to finish by saying one thing which is not in the chapter. And I'm not quite sure if it's in the book at all, Seán. I must read it through carefully to find this. The thing is that to be a mediator, to be involved in mediation, to be interested in mediation, and I would actually say, indeed, having spent 50 years as a peace researcher, in order to be a peace researcher looking into these topics, basically you need to be an optimist. You see so much rubbish all around. You see so many warnings being ignored. You see so many, and Alex talked about the fork in the road, you see so many wrong choices being made when the decisive choice sits in front of you, that you need to be an optimist. So what does a born optimist have to say to you right now? It is that if you imagine yourself back into the 1920s and the 1930s, I don't think it would have been easy to see the United Nations, the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, emerging in the 1940s and the 1950s. So things don't always move in a linear direction. That which is getting worse does not always get worse. Of course, there is one little caveat to my optimism there, which is it took a world war to do it. The challenge now is to do it without a world war. Thank you.
Thank you so much for our speakers for amazing points they have raised. We will take 4 questions, then I'll come back to the speakers. If there is any comment, just make it very short so we can have more questions. Please, can you introduce yourself, possible?
Thank you very much. My name is Álvaro Renedo. I'm the ambassador of Spain and a scholar myself in the field of international security. Congratulations to the Arab Center and to the authors of this very timely study and this contribution to literature and to policy debate. I find the title very compelling, and I appreciate also the references made to why and how our era is a very dangerous one. Not only owing to great power competition and the shifting of geopolitical balances and the proliferation of conflicts all over the world. I mean, this is probably in no other period after World War II have we lived so many conflicts simultaneously in different parts of the world. But also, as Dan Smith mentioned, efforts in non-proliferation are being eroded. And I think this is one of the most dangerous consequences of the war in Ukraine, the increasing perception all over the world that the ultimate security guarantee in international relations are nuclear weapons. So I think this highlights, this underscores the importance of peace mediation in an era not only of normative and institutional collapse, but also in a very dangerous era. So thank you very much, and I encourage you to continue your work and also focus on the importance of mitigating conflict in an area of increasing nuclear appetite. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, please, this lady.
Hello, I'm Basma Tabaja from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you for the very interesting panel. Maybe a question to Alex. You mentioned the various mediation efforts that are ongoing and how they always tend to serve or skew in the interest of the belligerents. I was wondering, from what we do, working in favor of those affected of armed conflict, at what point of the equation do the actual people, and in many cases the civilians impacted, factor in all of the mediation tracks that you studied? We also see now a multiplication of actors, mostly states, that are interested in picking up the mantra of mediation. It is the most attractive topic right now. Do you see this competitiveness as something conducive because a lot of effort is now increasingly being put into this file? Or is it actually being a bit more obstructive to more conducive efforts, especially that we don't always see them incorporating multilateral institutions and multilateralism, which is supposed and built to serve these issues? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Biplav Chowdhury. I'm from United Nations Development Program. Congratulations, first of all, to all the authors and to CHS for leading this very important and timely publication. I was just reflecting on all the panelists, and I think, Alex, you touched upon the question of development resources being available as a potential stabilizer of sorts. I happen to have served in South Sudan and Myanmar, earlier also in Sri Lanka during the LTT conflict days, and I can clearly, it resonates to what you just mentioned. And when you start to correlate this interesting insight with, let's say, the decline of ODAs that you're noticing these days, and the framing of development as a key driver of peace, complementing security efforts, mediation efforts, and that in itself is somewhat in question because if you don't have support in terms of development finance, it's very hard to imagine how these countries can potentially tackle the root causes of conflict. I think, Dan, you mentioned this point about the decline in terms of peace agreements from 100 to, say, 35. And I'm wondering, to what extent it's correlated with this declining ODAs. It's at a very superficial, high level, just sort of thinking about this. I'm sure there are many drivers for that, but, perhaps, this correlation could be interesting as well. And on Qatar, I would like to say that, yes, Qatar has done an amazing job. It's a tremendous champion of global public goods, a very significant leader and a voice in peace and mediation efforts. And I also think, Qatar is doing, through its own sort of support of, making development assistance available to a range of countries. That's a very nice complement to its mediation role. And I think, I haven't read the chapters, but I think this kind of a joining up of, not simply coming in for mediation, but also bringing in resources perhaps could be a nice complement, a nice framing to see how we can address these things more effectively with a, long-term vision. Thank you. But congratulations once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One question? Yes, gentleman there.
Okay, thank you very much for this great work. It's me, Hussam Ibrahim, researcher at CHS. My question is to Dr. Alex. I think my problem always be in the view, how we can addressing the conflict before we resolution. For examples in Sudan, when we take the case for Sudan, we always for you the problem how we addressing the problem in the authority, how to remove this authority to civilian, and not in the, and when we took the over the look about the problem, from my view, it depends on the militia and the arm. And if you take the view from another side, if addressing the problem is different from you, how we can making the view of free solution if we different in that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Dan, please.
So thank you very much. And a few very quick comments. Thank you for the questions and the comments. They were very, very interesting. I think it's absolutely right that the nuclear proliferation challenge is the one which is kind of, it's almost like it's creeping up and not being paid serious attention to. And we were talking in we were chatting informally beforehand about this odd thing that at the moment we're having a conversation in Europe about, you know, the revising of the nuclear deterrent. So Europe should have its own nuclear deterrent, with nobody seeming to discuss the fact that these nuclear weapons are of incredible destructive power, that they pose an existential threat. I mean, 40 years ago, when we were discussing cruise missiles and Pershing IIs and the SS-20, the destructive power and what the reality of a nuclear war would be like was at the forefront of our thinking. And it was out of this, in some senses, reflecting that Gorbachev and Reagan came up with their statement at Geneva, that, you know, a nuclear war can never be won, therefore it must never be fought. You make that the starting point, and you could think of moving in a positive direction. I suppose the tragic irony of today is that precisely that statement was reflected in a joint statement by the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council in January 2022, when they also said that the logic is we should not behave in arms racing ways, we should not behave in conflict generating and conflict escalating ways, and then about 6 weeks later, the escalation in Ukraine happened. But yes, this is a sensitive question that we need to bring much more into the forefront. I won't comment on the other very interesting remarks, except that made by our UNDP colleague. There is research which has shown, going back to the early 1990s, that if you look into official development assistance support to individual countries, and you look to see how much of that support has been tagged for peace and peace-building purposes, then although quite small proportions are tagged, you see much better peace outcomes in those countries where that was the case. And that research covers a period from about the early 1990s, 92, I think, until about 2021 or 22. And it was purely a statistical finding based on the tagging in the OECD records, which are, it's a little bit dodgy. The data is not incredibly strong, but that was the indication. And I think it is certainly the case that you have seen a tailing off, a sort of parallel declining interest in support for ODA, declining interest in support for peace building, as measured, for example, by support for the peace building fund in the UN, which is fairly small. At the same time as you have seen, on the one hand, what Alex is pointing to, which is in areas like the Horn of Africa, the finances coming into the political budgets and through that towards conflict. And as we're now seeing in the rich countries, a shift towards military spending. So I don't think that these different things can be divorced from each other at all. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you so much. Alex, please.
Thank you. Those are all very good questions, and time doesn't, unfortunately, permit me to give the answers that are commensurate with the quality of the questions. So let me be very brief. At what point do civilians factor in? Well, rhetorically they always do, but increasingly the rhetoric is hollow. I mean, we just heard a very telling example. that the P5 can say one thing at the Security Council and then go and do the exact opposite. And we're not seeing the real instruments that actually are meaningful in terms of civilian protection being utilized. So I'll just give a couple of examples. I mean, there's UN Security Council Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger, on activating the UN Security Council when conflict threatens famine. It's not been used. There's the International Criminal Court. There are other mechanisms for accountability for exposure at the UN, etc. And increasingly they are not being used and not being properly, they're just being disregarded. So peace peace and civilian protection, etc., becomes quite hollow in that context. Your question about competitiveness of peace processes. It can be a big problem when there are multiple peace processes, because then the belligerents can chop around. On the other hand, you can also have a problem when one peace process dominates and excludes others if it is not actually effective or not well-intentioned. So we do have a problem there. Just very briefly on the ODA question. I was just in London the last few days and was actually addressing the parliamentary committee on this very issue and making the point that the UK cannot turn inwards and just think about its own security without looking more broadly around the world and saying, going back to the vision that it had even a few years ago of saying that the national security of the United Kingdom is bound up with the prosperity and the stability of countries in the Middle East and Africa. And it's extraordinarily myopic to think that you can cut your aid budget without having these consequences. And I would also just add that I think investment in peace research is an incredibly good investment in terms of value for money. On Sudan, I think we can agree. We agree on what has to be the outcome, and it's just tragic to see the degree of polarization within Sudan and the degree to which that polarization is being fueled by social media and by foreign external interests as well. This is a discussion that we could have at great length. And then the last thing that I just want to say, which is my personal agenda heading up the World Peace Foundation, is we're not talking about world peace. And I think until we start really talking about world peace, we're going to find ourselves stuck in the weeds of solving this problem, that problem, without those attempted solutions being oriented towards a greater vision and a bigger goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sarah?
Yeah, very briefly, because I was in response basically to what the ambassador said and also the colleague from UNDP. I think sometimes also when we say mediation is in crisis, and some of the peace activities that we see currently, they indeed look very bleak. I think it's important to also remind ourselves that not all around mediation is in crisis. It's a very specific model that we for a long time kind of took for granted around mediation, which is in crisis, which in an upcoming book or forthcoming book I call the consent-based conflict resolution model of mediation, which was also sort of promoted mostly by the UN. But we can remind ourselves also that mediation is very much also a mindset and a skill set that can be used in non-proliferation negotiations, but also I spend a lot of time in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and their mediation is daily used also, of course, in addressing land conflicts by UNDP and other colleagues, but also just by the population. So I think when saying mediation is in crisis, it's important to distinguish the different levels and to really be clear about what is really in crisis, because from what is not in crisis around mediation, we can take maybe also ideas and opportunities for the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Sara, for your for sharing your thought, ideas. And before you go, this is a knowledge production, and in this context, I would like to thank Dr. Ghassan and Dr. Seán for the great efforts they have done to produce this knowledge and to make it available to the people. Knowledge production today is preserving memory of what we do in our generation, what we will move to the future generations. Talking about peace and how to build peace and how to make life peaceful, this is an amazing, in a time where war, debate, words, terminologies, narratives are basically covering. So I would like you to share with me this great attitude to Dr. Ghassan and Seán for their efforts, and also to all authors. They have put their thoughts and ideas in this book. My special thanks to Dr. Ghassan and Seán for inviting me to chair this session. Thank you so much. Thank you all and have a great day. Assalamu alaikum.